Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'm Maria Inés Corra, and on behalf of the Latin American Arbitration Association, ALAR, I'm delighted to welcome you all to this first joint virtual seminar organized with the Hong Kong International Arbitration Center. Let me first introduce and express ALAR's gratitude to our panelists today. Kiran Shangera is the Deputy Secretary General of the Center with management and strategic roles. Kiran knows very well Latin America because she lived in Uruguay, from where she developed the center's Latin American outreach many years ago. Sean Jung is a partner and head of Freshfields China International Arbitration Practice and council member and chair of the Proceedings Committee of the Center. He has a long standing experience both in commercial and investment arbitration, as well as in investigation and regulatory matters. Claudia Benavides Galvis, our Latin American representative in this panel. She has founded her own boutique law firm this year, Benavides Mejia, Dispute Resolution. Before that, she was former global chair of Baker McKenzie's dispute resolution practice. With a vast experience both as counsel and arbitrator, and having represented Chinese companies in international arbitration, Claudia is also council member of the center and a dearest member and co-chair of a large construction arbitration committee. I would also like to thank Luis Wong from HKIAC and Andrea Santa Coloma from ALAR for making this webinar happen. Let me now introduce ALAR to those who don't know the association yet. ALAR is a leading arbitration institution in Latin America that has actively contributed to the development of international arbitration in and from the region during the last 15 years. With more than 700 members, ALAR has emerged as an enlightening voice for the improvement of international arbitration practice in our jurisdictions and the international community. Now, going to the topic for today, Latin American companies involved in international trade not only are familiar to international arbitration, but they use arbitration as main dispute resolution mechanism in key sectors as energy, mining, infrastructure, where at the same time Latin America and Asia long-term partnership have experienced an increasing role. Latin America also has sophisticated lawyers and arbitrators. However, when we keep an eye on Latin America and Asia trade and related disputes, several intuitive questions and concerns may likely arise. For instance, how to better manage parties from such different legal cultures, how to select proper arbitrators for those disputes, how to satisfy expectations from parties that may substantially differ. Parties want and deserve good answers to these kind of questions, but not everyone can provide those answers. As we know, the arbitral system success will ultimately relies on the confidence and trust that arbitral tribunal and institutions are able to build up. And the first step to ensure that trust is raising the community's awareness and better knowledge about their background. The HKIAC, as one of the most prestigious Asian arbitral centers, is fully aware of this. So is ALARP. That's why we decided to start a collaboration pathway and organize this first webinar to provide our communities with the opportunity to know about more about the Hong Kong International Arbitration Center long-standing and unique benefits. Now, without more delay, I'll pass the floor to our excellent panel. We are eager to listen to you all. Thank you very much again.
Thank you enormously, Maria-Ines. On behalf of HKIAC, it's really a pleasure to work with Alarb and with you as president, and of course thanks to Andrea and as well as to Louise for getting us organized and together today. Also thanks to those who are interested in the topic and who are here already and who are joining as we speak. Also a thanks to John Chung and Claudia Benavides, who are joining me today with their HKIAC hats on, and they wear many hats, but we're very grateful at HKIAC for the external support that we get from some of the leading members of the arbitration community globally to support the work that we do, both in our cases and broader governance. So we're very grateful, and they certainly add to the credibility of the organization. We understood, and our main aim for today is really to give those who perhaps don't have direct experience or perhaps less experience with arbitration at the Hong Kong International Arbitration Center an idea of what the center is, how we operate, our objectives, our structure, our systems, the way that our rules work, and specifically the types of disputes that we handle at the center and the types of parties that use our services. So we'll do that by splitting our talk into a few different sections. So I'll kick off with an overall introduction into HKIAC, and then will be followed by a sort of a deeper dive into our rules and some of the important bodies that make decisions on HKIAC cases. And John will cover that in his role as a council member and also chairperson of our proceedings committee, one of our very busy committees at the HKIAC. We'll then look actually at Hong Kong and its arbitration infrastructure and its very unique positioning vis-a-vis mainland China. And then we'll move through to a session where we hear from Claudia Benavides about the Latin American perspective on this topic and her engagement with the region and specifically with HKIAC. And we'll conclude with a few observations from both John and Claudia that might be of interest to those Latin American practitioners on doing business and handling disputes with Asian and including mainland Chinese parties. So that's the flow for what we will cover. And we have some slides to do that initially. If you have questions, we'd certainly welcome those. So please feel free to put those in the chat and we'll address them as we go, but there will be also time for that at the end. So if we get to the end and you have a question and you'd like to ask it, please also raise your hand. But if you think of things as we're talking, please put them into the chat. So with that, a few minutes behind schedule, but we will kick off with a brief overview of HKIAC. So we've been around, and you can see from this first slide, for quite some time now. We're 40 years old this year. And as was mentioned kindly by Maria-Ines, we're one of the leading arbitral institutions globally. And through the various surveys, more specifically the Queen Mary survey, we've been ranked top 3 for a number of years now. And we're independent and non-profit. And today we'll talk about arbitration, but we do offer adjudication, mediation, domain name dispute resolution, in addition to arbitration. Focusing in here on our arbitration services. So we offer case administration, so managing the process from start to finish. And we do that under 2 sets of rules. We have our own HKIAC administered arbitration rules, and you'll hear about those a little bit later. And that's certainly where most of our administered arbitration cases come through. But we also do handle, and have been for a long time handling, the administration of arbitrations under the UNCITRAL arbitration rules. Also, we have an important role under the Hong Kong arbitration legislation. We're the default statutory appointing authority. So oftentimes we'll receive requests in ad hoc arbitrations for the appointment of an arbitrator or the determination of an arbitration, whether a determination on the number of arbitrators where the arbitration is seated in Hong Kong. In terms of our structure, we have a transparent governance structure, and we are led by our council members. And we have 2 of them here today. And the composition is about 30 people from across the globe with deep experience in arbitration, either as practitioners at leading firms, independent arbitrators. We have in-house counsel, and our co-chairs are David Rivkin, formerly of Debevoise and Plimpton, and perhaps known to many of you, and also Rimsky Yoon, who is our former Secretary for Justice and now a very highly in-demand arbitrator. Under the council sits the Executive Committee, and that is a small group that assists with more of the day-to-day or more frequent questions that we have in terms of our decision-making strategy and approach. And then we have the 3 darker boxes, our Finance and Administration Committee. It's clear what that group would do. And then the 2 committees that are most relevant for today's discussion, and John will talk about in more detail, are the Proceedings Committee and the Appointments Committee. So unlike the ICC, for example, we do not have a standing court, but we have 2 committees that are responsible for different elements of decision-making on cases. And so we'll hear more about that later. And then we have the Secretariat. A few photos here, but we're an international and experienced group. Myself as the Deputy Secretary General, and our Secretary General Joanne Lau, who was a partner at Allen & Overy before moving over to us, plus 10 members of the arbitration team, various nationalities, Chinese, so Hong Kong and mainland, Canada, India, Russia, the Philippines, the UK and the US. And we can also handle cases in a number of different languages, English, Chinese, Italian, Spanish, Filipino, French and Russian. Both common law and civil law backgrounds, and most of us have been to some of the leading universities across the globe. In terms of our general trajectory, our case numbers have been growing and increasing for some time. And last year was a record year for us. So we had 352 new arbitration matters commenced under 510 contracts. So there are provisions within our rules that allow a single arbitration to be commenced under multiple contracts, hence why you have a higher number of contracts to the number of arbitrations filed. And it's a provision that's used with some frequency that we'll hear about a little bit later on. In terms of the timing of contracts, over 65% of the cases filed in 2024 including contracts signed within the last 5 years, and 40% of those since 2022. So we continue to see users select HKIAC and also select Hong Kong as a seat, although of course we know they don't necessarily have to. In terms of the value on our cases, we've also seen that increase year in, year out. And I think as a general comment, what we've seen in our caseload is increasing complexity, so multi-party, multi-contract disputes, and also increasing value. And that's a shift that we've seen over the last few years. But you can see there all our arbitrations, the total value in 2024 was $13.6 billion US. Just breaking that down a little bit, the largest segment in terms of value of case is cases between 1 million and 10 million US dollars, which is just over a third. And importantly to note, from 10 million and above, that also represents a significant percentage of the cases that we're handling. So we do see a variety of values, and we do have a number of cases that do exceed 100 million US dollars. a few snapshot pieces of information to give you a flavour of the centre and the types of cases that we handle. So most of our cases, without a doubt, are international. And by that, we mean involve at least one non-Hong Kong party. What we've seen steadily is an increase in cases that involve no Asian connection. So last year that was 15%, the year before that that was 10%, and the year before that was 5%. So we are seeing that happen too, but it's certainly the case that most of our cases involve Asian parties, and about 40% or so involve mainland Chinese parties. Most commonly chosen governing law, where our home is Hong Kong, and as often the case with centres, the most common law is that the law of where we're based as the governing law. So Hong Kong law comes up very frequently, but closely followed by English law. We've also seen Chinese law be applied to the contracts that we've seen increasingly, as well as 15 different governing laws, including civil law jurisdictions from common law from continental Europe, Japan, Korean, US, so there's a variety there. In terms of seat of arbitration in 2024, Hong Kong was most commonly selected. Other seats we saw Dubai and London, and in some cases the seat at the time of filing the notice of arbitration was unspecified. In terms of language, the majority of our cases are conducted in English, and the language of the arbitration agreement is English. Not surprising, the next most popular language is Chinese, and that's where we see about 16% of our cases, and our staff are able to handle those because of their background. And then we have some cases that are run in English and Chinese, and we're pretty sure that when those clauses were drafted, it wasn't necessarily the intention that they be run that way, but we still see cases come in like that. And there's, of course, a time and cost consequence, but we do see those too. In terms of who's using us and where are they coming from, you can see there are 53 jurisdictions. The top 10 are pretty consistent in many ways, year in, year out. Hong Kong, mainland China. BVI and Cayman, oftentimes those entities will have at least part Chinese backing. Singaporean parties also feature, and despite headlines and comments about relationships between the two, the USA also features frequently with a mainland Chinese entity on the other side. South Korea is also present frequently, and the Philippines, a Southeast Asian country. But what's new for us is the UAE. So we're seeing an increase in parties from the Middle East. When it comes to Latin America, we looked back over the past 5 or 6 years, and we've seen parties from Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Mexico, Panama, and Uruguay. And if we look back further, we have had cases involving most jurisdictions in Latin America. Now, the counterparties or the non-Latin American parties involved in those disputes have varied geographical origins. So a lot of them involve mainland Chinese parties on the other side, Hong Kong, UAE, South Korea, Taiwan. But we have seen cases involving multiple parties from multiple jurisdictions involving Latin American parties, and you can see them listed there. The types of disputes involved where we've had cases with Latin American parties are fairly diverse and also fairly standard in nature. So commercial, sale of goods, international trade, financial disputes, corporate, so shareholder agreements, disputes over those and joint ventures, as well as maritime and cryptocurrency. We've seen English law selected, Hong Kong law selected, and Singapore law selected in those agreements, where disputes have arisen with Latin American parties. Just a point here, HKIAC operates both a panel and a list of arbitrators. So the panel is for more experienced arbitrators who have in fact had a number of appointments. And the selection process for entry is slightly higher than for the list of arbitrators. So the list is for those that perhaps have had a long career in arbitration is cancelled, but have only had one appointment or perhaps are looking for their first. And so the requirements to join the list are slightly lower, and it's our effort to diversify the pool and grow the pipeline of arbitrators. So hence why we run the list and the panel. We have 22 arbitrators who are from Latin America currently on our panel and list, and they come from across the region. Just a point here, we are known for, and our experience shows that we do have significant expertise in China-related disputes, which is of course very relevant in many parts of the world, but particularly in Latin America, given the significant amount of trade and investment into the region. So what we have seen over the years, and certainly since I've been involved with HKIAC, is parties are using HKIAC for contracts involving mainland Chinese and non-mainland Chinese parties. It's the suitable compromise in those situations, as we'll learn a little bit later, but Hong Kong is a separate legal jurisdiction, and HKIAC is an international arbitral institution that is an offshore institution for the purposes of mainland Chinese users. So a few points here just to flag. I mean, we have one of the largest caseloads involving Chinese parties amongst all arbitral institutions outside of mainland China. And quite importantly, we have an experienced pool of arbitrators that have a neutral nationality, so not a mainland Chinese geographical origin, and experience in disputes between mainland and non-mainland Chinese parties. And that includes the ability to navigate disputes in both English and Chinese. We have many commercial Chinese entities, private entities in our caseload, but we do see state-owned enterprises select HKIAC for their contracts, as we can imagine, and as many of those big infrastructure projects in Latin America are run by state-owned enterprises. We see them selecting HKIAC. And we'll get to the next 2 points, the grey and the darker blue, in later in our presentation, but these are probably two very important factors just to flag for the moment. There's a very unique tool that HKIAC and Hong Kong seated arbitrations have, whereby parties can seek interim relief from mainland courts, and it's the only place outside of mainland China where that's possible. And also, equally importantly, there is a special relationship between Hong Kong and mainland China with respect to the enforcement of arbitral awards, and we have a strong HKIAC awards have a strong track record there. Just to comment a little bit about how we do in terms of timing and costs. Here are a few bits of data for you, which were taken from cases from November 2013 through to April 2023, and we're in the process of updating this report at the moment. But you can see there that the duration of arbitrations at HKIAC during that period was 15 months, the median amount, which is probably more reflective of the reality rather than the mean, because we did have a few cases that took slightly longer for procedural reasons and other reasons. So the more significant number or more reflective number is the 15 months, together with the costs of arbitration we looked at. So those were the tribunal's fees and our own administrative fees, and the median figure there is $75,500 US. We offer an expedited arbitration, and you can see there that the duration is shorter, as one would expect, and in most cases it took 6 months for the tribunal to render an award, which is the stipulated period under the relevant arbitration rules. And the costs there are significantly less, at just over $32,000 US as a median figure. I'm going to pause here and hand over to John. And the reason I'm doing, well, there's many reasons, but in particular, John will talk about the rules and, in fact, the 2024 rules, and also about the two standing committees, because he's chairperson of one of them. But he was also very heavily involved with the recent revisions to the 2024 rules. So I'll pause here and hand over to John. So thanks, John, over to you.
Thank you, Kieran, and very good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining our session, and really a pleasure, privilege to be speaking about various matters relating to the HKIAC rules. So as Kieran mentioned, let me start with an introduction to the recently revised 2024 HKIAC administered arbitration rules. So the previous version of the rules was from 2018, so there was a kind of 6-year gap there. And these rules are, as it were, relatively hot off the press. It came into effect on 1st June 2024. So let's start with some of the core principles that remained unchanged in the rules, because really, in essence, the rules have been working very well, and there's been no need to make a fundamental change to the rules, but there have been various improvements which we'll come to. So the core principles that remain unchanged. HKIAC continues to adopt a light touch approach. I think Kieran alluded to that. That is one of the hallmarks of HKIAC arbitration. It is not an administration heavy set of rules or institution, and that is what our users tell us repeatedly that they want, which is efficiency and really a set of rules that works and arrives at an award without being too cumbersome. Choice of hourly rate, again, that is an option when it comes to how arbitrators are remunerated. You can either go for that approach, or, and this is fairly unusual, and one of the special features of HKIAC rules, you can, as an alternative, elect to go for what are essentially skill fees or ad valorem fees, which are based on the amount in dispute. Um, the other points on the slide, and if we can move forwards to slide 15. Yeah, so slide 15, just wrapping up on that, a couple of additional points there, and if we can move backwards by one slide to 15. Excellent. So there again, a couple of points which remain unchanged, how arbitrators are appointed, some of the provisions around dealing with the more complex issues that Kieran alluded to. Again, those provisions have largely remained unchanged. The expedited procedures, which have worked well, emergency arbitration, those haven't really been changed. There is an amendment that's been made in relation to how time limits are computed, but in terms of the time limit itself for rendering awards, that also has remained unchanged, which is 3 months from effectively close of proceedings. So let's now move on to slide 16 and talk about some of the key objectives really around the rules and what we were trying to achieve with this latest round of revisions. So again, the 3 key points up there on screen, but let me take us through each of these points moving on to slide 17 there. So the first of these 3 objectives are around ensuring that we have changes in place to deal with time and cost savings, because as we know, that's increasingly a really important consideration in international arbitration. So Article 16, we made it explicitly clear in the rules that tribunals have a whole range of case management powers. They actually probably already have these provisions and these powers, but it is useful to actually explicitly set it out in the rules to encourage tribunals to use these powers, powers such as the ability encourages tribunals to move along much more quickly. I just want to make sure that my reception has been smooth. Very good. And closure of proceedings, again, if we can move back to slide 17 there. Slide 17 there. So again, just around closure proceedings on slide 17. Excellent, there we are. Is that one of the changes that the HKIAC made was essentially to make it clearer that once proceedings have actually ended in a substantive hearing or in a substantive submission, then essentially the clock does start counting down from there. And the tribunals are expected to declare proceedings to be closed 45 days thereafter. So here is really intended in simple terms to serve as a prod to tribunals to move on with the proceedings and them and then issue the award within 3 months thereafter. So that's around time and cost savings. If we can move on to slide 18 next on screen. And these are just three examples of changes to the rules to deal with efficiency and integrity of the arbitration proceedings. So we have made some changes to make it clear that HKIAC can consider the efficiency, integrity of the arbitration when it comes to designation of arbitrators, and may revoke appointments, but this is again only in exceptional circumstances. So again, an important case management rule on the part of HKIAC. Similarly, we've made it clear that the tribunal may exclude replacement counsel. So this is a scenario where you might have a replacement counsel appear in the proceedings fairly late in the day, and that might then create a conflict of interest. And so what this provision is intended to do is to avoid that situation, giving the tribunal the power to exclude a counsel who is newly added to the case if necessary to avoid a conflict of interest. The last point there on the slide is around the HKIAC's power to review the tribunal's fees. And again, this is to make adjustments to fees and expenses to, as it were, exercise some degree of oversight around fees. Concerns to parties on that front. Let me just kind of switch my speaking device a little bit. To be encountering some slide issues on that front, but hopefully this is a little bit clearer now. So then moving on to slide 19, the last of the three series of slides here. So this deals with developments in international arbitration itself. So diversity has always been of paramount consideration to the HKIAC, an important one at any rate. So here we see that HKIAC provision makes it clear that parties, arbitrators are encouraged to take diversity into account when appointing arbitrators. So again, really quite a cutting-edge provision there from the HKIAC rules. Similarly, a focus on greener arbitrations and tribunals considering the environmental impact of arbitrations and how they have been conducted when they're allocating costs. So again, a provision that's an interesting one that has attracted quite a lot of attention from parties, from users, and again, I think illustrates how HKIAC is seeking to push the boundaries of this. And also there are provisions there dealing with information security, which again, as we know, is an important consideration, particularly as we've seen more and more of these issues come up in arbitrations. So that's a fairly quick canter through some of the changes that have been introduced through the 2024 arbitration rules. I'll now move on to talk about some of the bodies that sit within the HKIAC, in particular to focus on two of the important bodies. And again, the point here is to illustrate how the HKIAC actually goes about conducting its business. So the first of the two bodies I'll talk about is the Appointments Committee, which, as you can imagine, is the committee that actually appoints arbitrators, or in some cases confirms arbitrators who have been nominated or designated by parties. So if we look at the composition of the committee, that comprises individuals from 10 different nationalities based in 7 locations, comprising leading arbitrators as well as in-house counsel and practitioners and counsel in law firms, both international and in-house and local. And really here the point is to illustrate how international the committee is. For the HKIAC, this is of particular importance because you want to make sure that we are really getting access to the full pool of knowledge out there and the whole range of arbitrators are available. So the Appointments Committee appoints arbitrators, as I mentioned. They also decide on the number of arbitrators and they fix the costs of the arbitration when skill fees are applied. So we move on to the next slide. We will see some statistics around appointments. So HKIAC in 2024 made about 200 appointments, but what is more important is the diversity of the appointments. So there we see that the arbitrators appointed came from 25 different geographic origins or nationalities, and you see a breakdown of some of the top geographical origins are arbitrators with a Hong Kong connection, unsurprisingly at the top of the list, but not particularly high, actually at 31%. And you see a whole list of other arbitrators in different nationalities further down that list. Importantly, 35% of appointments in 2024 made by the HKIAC were of female arbitrators. 37% were arbitrators not previously appointed in the past 3 years. This is a point Kieran alluded to in the introductions, and again, that underscores the desire, the push on the part of HKIAC to ensure that we have a diverse range of arbitrators. you'll be pleased to hear that arbitrators have been appointed from 74 different nationalities or origins, which are on the HKIAC's panel and list of arbitrators. And in terms of appointments, again, in 2024, I know that there were appointments, for example, of arbitrators from Argentina, from Brazil, and of course, arbitrators who are Spanish-speaking, Spanish speakers. And again, we have them also on both the panel and the list of arbitrators. So those are the arbitrators. And again, that's particularly important because, as we know, the quality of an arbitration is dependent on the quality of the arbitrators, and the independence and neutrality there is particularly important because, as Kieran alluded to, and I imagine a lot of the matters involving LATAM that we have seen, of course, involve Chinese parties. And that's where HKIAC is a natural choice of an arbitration institution, and Hong Kong as a seat. And again, you want to be absolutely confident that you're getting a broad representation of arbitrators, which you are, as you can see from the screen. So 7% from the mainland, but a much larger proportion from a range of jurisdictions. Moving then on to slide 22 then. And here, this is the Proceedings Committee. In simple terms, really the court of arbitration at the HKIAC, which makes essentially all the important procedural decisions. So this is a committee which I chair and sit on. The key functions that we're involved in is we decide challenges that are made to arbitrators. Unsurprisingly, that's been increasingly contentious in recent years, and we are seeing trickier and trickier challenges in this space coming before us. The Proceedings Committee also decides whether an arbitration should proceed on a prima facie basis, essentially whether there's an agreement to HKIAC arbitration, for example. It decides what increasingly complicated issues around consolidation and joinder, as well as the use of the expedited procedure that we mentioned earlier, which allows for expedition for proceedings move along more quickly, essentially for less complex, lower value disputes arbitrations. We also look at revisions to the HKIAC rules, and as I mentioned, there were some recent revisions in 2024. So again, the composition very international in nature and covering a whole range of practitioners, in-house counsel, and arbitrators. Again, the key there is to make sure that we take on board views from both the users, the in-house counsel, as well as from in-house arbitrators, certainly, and law firm counsel. So that's around slide 22. And if we then move on to the next slide, which gives you a snapshot of some of the procedural decisions made by the Proceedings Committee in 2024. So in total, 67 decisions were made by the committee in 2024, so really quite a large volume of decisions. One of the things that we pride ourselves in the Proceedings Committee is the speed and efficiency around which decisions are made, and these are typically made within a couple of days, in some cases even shorter than that, because that's, again, a hallmark of HKIAC arbitrations. Some of the more important decisions have been made. We are seeing quite a lot of increasing situations where parties invoking Article 29, the HKIAC rules. And this is really the provision that deals with multiple contracts. So where parties try to commence a single arbitration under multiple contracts. So for example, if you have a project finance dispute in LATAM, involving, say, a Chinese construction project, then you might have a dispute that arises under both the EPC contract as well as under the financing documentation, and that's where parties might try to start a single arbitration, pooling on all the interested parties using the Article 29 powers. So we're seeing many applications of that nature. We're seeing a fair number of applications involving non-signatories to agreements, and we are seeing an increased use of the expedited procedure, which in simple terms are disputes where typically the amount in dispute is below about $3 million. And moving then on to slide 24. And here a quick canter through, and I think canter is the appropriate word, around efficiency and expedition. So we are seeing at the HKIAC a significant number of cases involving multiple parties of contract. You can see that on screen, 134 cases in 2024 alone. Emergency arbitrator applications, we only saw 5 of them in 2024. And to date, we have seen about 40 such cases from the introduction of those provisions into rules at the HKIAC. Now, this might be surprising, but for reasons that Kieran will explain, one of the important tools, and she alluded to this at the outset, is this really significant arrangement, the interim measures arrangement that exists between Hong Kong and the mainland. And for that reason, sometimes and often parties are better off relying on this unique arrangement that exists between the mainland and Hong Kong, rather than to rely on a more traditional emergency arbitrator application that you see on screen. Expedited procedure applications, we saw 24 of these in 2024, and we are seeing an uptick in that space. So with that, let me then move on to the next section in our discussion, which Kieran will first introduce.
Thank you so much, John. I'll just say, as a member of the Secretariat, both of those committees are extremely busy, and as you can see, 199 appointments were directly made by HKIAC, and that requires the involvement for the majority of those of the Appointments Committee in helping us determine out of the ranking who should be approached. And so it's a busy committee. And then, as you saw there for the Proceedings Committee, more than one decision a week. And those decisions are complex and require time and thought, as John mentioned. So we're incredibly grateful for how nimble these two committees can be and how quickly they can make decisions. We will, so that's the piece effectively on HKIAC specifically. Now, we thought it was probably worth spending a few minutes on Hong Kong as a seat and its arbitration framework, also in the context of how Hong Kong sits within China and how that's relevant for arbitration practice. So what I'll do there, now that I've given John the opportunity to take a breath, is just come back to John to talk to us a little bit about some of the unique features of Hong Kong and mainland, and some of the features of Hong Kong as a seat of arbitration.
Sure. And let me just start off by talking about the one country, two systems place that is in place as between Hong Kong and mainland China. So sometimes there's a little bit of confusion around it. This one country, two systems is unique to Hong Kong. So under this system, Hong Kong very much retains its existing common English law-based legal system, while remaining, of course, as a special administrative region within China. Now, the Hong Kong English common law system, as we know, has a long tradition of, for example, the use of precedents, and therefore Hong Kong is able to draw on the richness of English law and indeed of the English barrister tradition. Now, we look at the court system in Hong Kong. At its apex is a court of final appeal in Hong Kong, and typically for hearings before the court of final appeal, that's before 5 judges, and importantly, one of these 5 judges is a distinguished judge from outside of Hong Kong, and that is again important because of the significance around the independence and neutrality of the Hong Kong legal system and of the judiciary. Now, applications to set aside awards, to resist enforcement of awards, and to seek ancillary relief are all made to the Hong Kong court system, as you can imagine. Now, sometimes you occasionally hear about parties who are less familiar with the Hong Kong system being concerned around the independence of the Hong Kong courts. For example, if there's a mainland party that is involved, this is not an issue. We regularly see, for example, Chinese state-owned companies being sued before the Hong Kong courts. These are a matter of public record, and of course, they do lose in some of these claims, including claims running into the billions of US dollars. Now, perhaps you can take a closer look at the slide here, and you will see a reference there to the UNCITRAL model law. Hong Kong is an UNCITRAL model law jurisdiction, but in addition to that, it has really a state-of-the-art piece of arbitration legislation with various improvements and tag-alongs that were added to the default UNCITRAL model law provisions. We also have the availability of third-party funding, of contingency fees in arbitrations in Hong Kong. And there is also provision in the ordinance that makes it very clear that intellectual property disputes are arbitrable. Hong Kong has specialist arbitration judges, which means that typically if you have an arbitration-related dispute, there's a high likelihood it will go to a specialist arbitration judge who is particularly familiar with arbitration, and that results in much higher quality decision. And this is really illustrated by this graph that you see on the slide. In particular, if you look at 2024, for example, there were 100 applications to enforce arbitration awards in Hong Kong, and only one of these provisional orders that was made by the court was set aside. So really a very impressive track record where it emphasizes the pro-enforcement attitude of the Hong Kong courts. And with that, let me pass the time back to Kieran to talk about the interim measures arrangement, which you have heard so much about, but Kieran can do a very good job of explaining that a little bit further.
Thank you, John. And for those in attendance here, these are the last few slides that we'll be talking to, so bear with us. As John mentioned, there are two key arrangements that are pretty crucial. I think if you're thinking about if you are thinking about advising a client, or if you are the client, that you should take into account when deciding whether to seek your arbitration in Hong Kong. Of course, we know that with HKIAC rules, you don't have to seek your arbitration in Hong Kong, but it's worth highlighting that there are actually two very tangible and unique features of seeking your arbitration in Hong Kong if your counterparty, or if there is a mainland Chinese element to your contract or project. So the first one is the most recent one, and this is the arrangement on interim measures. Now, it came into force in October 2019, and it was pretty game-changing when we heard about it. It effectively means that for the first time, parties to an arbitration seated outside of mainland China could in fact seek interim measures in aid of that arbitration from mainland Chinese courts. Prior to this point, the only way you could seek interim relief on the mainland was if your arbitration was seated on the mainland. And so the very unique thing for Hong Kong is the only place where that's possible outside of mainland China. So when this development came, we were rather excited about it because it effectively meant that you could seek interim relief from mainland Chinese courts to obtain the preservation of assets, evidence, or conduct. Now, this is reciprocal, but so it's the same for those seeking that relief in Hong Kong. But the unique part is that it's the first time that it's available outside of mainland China. And I sometimes am a skeptic. So when this came into force in 2019, I was pleased, but I wanted to see how it would operate in reality and in practice. And I think this probably is the most important slide to take away. So the arrangement has been in place since 2019, and you can see there from the map the number of intermediate people's courts in a number of different cities that have handled applications under the interim measures arrangement. So all of those relate to arbitrations at HKIAC seated in Hong Kong. And since 2019 through to the end of 2024, we have seen 145 applications for assets, evidence, and conduct. We've processed that many. 138 were for asset preservation, so by far the majority, 2 for evidence preservation, 4 for conduct preservation, and 1 for asset and conduct. Importantly, of the 145, and this is what makes it impactful, 106 decisions were issued and 102 of those applications were granted. So what that tells us is, in fact, the mainland courts are engaging with this arrangement So applications are being granted, and you'll see the last point there to high value, to the value of $3.4 billion worth of assets. So I think this is, if you're going to take away one thing, which I hope you take away a little bit more than one, but this is probably the thing to remember, because it's the most tangible development that we've seen applied in practice and function and work in practice. The other arrangement has been in place for much longer, but it's worth just spending a moment on. So between Hong Kong and the mainland, after Hong Kong was returned to the mainland in 1997, the New York Convention no longer applied between Hong Kong and mainland China. However, as John has explained, Hong Kong is a separate legal jurisdiction. It's an offshore foreign legal jurisdiction for the purposes of the recognition and enforcement of arbitral awards. So what was introduced in 1999 was there an arrangement for the recognition of Hong Kong awards into mainland China. The terms are similar to the New York Convention, but we do see a very positive and strong enforcement track record when it comes to Hong Kong HKIAC awards. And as far as we're aware, only 3 HKIAC awards have not been enforced in the mainland for over 20 years. So that's also an important arrangement that I think, since the interim measures arrangement came into force, we probably talk about a lot less than we should, but these are the two concluding points when we're talking about Hong Kong as a seat with respect to mainland Chinese disputes are probably the most relevant. So that's where we wanted to finish when in relation to Hong Kong and HKIAC, but we wanted to bring in our very patient council member from Latin America, Claudia Benavides, who has been a close friend of the Centre for many years now, and who I first met when I was living in South America in 2013 and was busy traveling across the continent. And I ended up in Bogota and realized how important that jurisdiction was and the people there, and where I met Claudia. And so I'm pleased to see her as a council member. But what we wanted to do with the time that we had left was get some perspectives from a Latin American practitioner, and a few points, Claudia, if you could address them for us, but you know, what you do at HKIAC, but also your experience and interactions with us, why you think HKIAC is important or not, but I'm hoping you will say we are, and you know, what you think is relevant for Chinese and Latin American, why China and Asia is relevant to Latin American parties. And also what you like about Hong Kong.
Thank you, Kieran. Well, first of all, let me say thank you again to you and to Maria Inés for this very kind invitation. I'm delighted to be here in this conversation. It has been certainly a delight to be part of the HKIAC Council, and I would also say that it has been a learning experience too. The HKIAC Council, as Kieran already explained, it consists of a diverse group of around 30 people, which includes professionals in private practice, it includes arbitrators, it also includes corporate counsel. And they come, several of them are Chinese, their nationality is Chinese, but some others also come from different jurisdictions across the globe. And so among the members of the council, we found backgrounds that span both civil and common law traditions, representing an important range of legal systems and also of industries. So in my view, and in my experience, based on what I've seen, the composition of the council somehow exemplifies HKIAC's growing commitment, I would say, to meeting users' expectations and incorporating firsthand insights with different perspectives. And essentially what we do at the council is in that context that I've already mentioned, and drawing on extensive expertise in dispute resolution matters from the members, then the council provides guidance, I would say, to the Secretariat on policy matters and on overall administration of the center. And I do have to say that something that has caught my attention is that these sessions, where they are, first of all, scheduled very well in advance, so you do know when you have those sessions, and so that assures participation, but it is a lot of work that has been previously done by the members of the Secretariat, led by the Secretary General, prior to each one of those sessions, making those sessions of the Council really very efficient, in my opinion. So through my interactions with HKIAC over the years, I have to say that I've always found a very responsive, professional team that reflects the strong commitment of the center to delivering high quality service to the users. And so at the time, it was very easy to become a member of the council, considering, of course, the center's reputation. As Kiran mentioned earlier today, HKIAC is a top 3 world international arbitration center. And as it was mentioned also by Kiran, I think you made reference to the recent 2025 White and Case and Queen Mary International Arbitration Survey. This survey has been taking place several years, and the survey shows not only how the center is a preferred center in terms of international arbitration, but also the rules themselves. No, HKIAC's rules are also among the top preferred rules by users. And Hong Kong has been also traditionally among a preferred seat by users. So that, together with the fact that there has been a continuously growing business relationship between LATAM and Asian companies, particularly from China, made it very interesting for me to be part of the council and to participate in it. I think that we've already mentioned how important it has been, the growth of the business relationship between China, Asia in general, and LATAM, but China in particular. I would say China is one of the region's main investors and trading partners, and there have been billions of dollars directed towards, I would say, strategic industries in Latin America, such as energy, mining, infrastructure, technology. And many countries, and just to name a few, like Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, Panama, Peru, have received significant inflows of Chinese companies investing or being the main contractors of large-scale projects that include, among others, railways, ports, renewable energy parks, you name it. So China's economic footprint in Latin America has been steadily growing, and the presence in our economies has continued to expand. Just to name a few examples, probably many of you already know about this very important project, but I have to name one in my country, which is the metro, the construction of the metro in Bogota. It's one of the most important infrastructure projects currently taking place in the country, and China Harbor Engineering and Shan Petro Company are the ones building it. In Peru, for instance, there's the Chancay port, and Costco Shipping is leading that. Also Chinese. In Argentina, and probably Maria Inés knows very well about it, the Cauchari Solar Power Complex, which is, as I understand, it's one of the biggest solar plants in LATAM, and it's led by Power China. Sorry. So as you can see, and these are just to name a few very important projects coming from Chinese companies, or where Chinese companies participate, and so the interaction is strong and continues to grow. You mentioned, Kiran, what about Hong Kong as a city? Just very briefly, of course, it's a wonderful city. It has been a delight to be in Hong Kong. It's not only a renowned business center, but it's also fascinating, because it's international, vibrant, culturally rich, has delicious food, Cantonese cuisine, and so many nice places to visit. I don't know, the temples, the Kowloon area, hiking trails, beautiful views, you name it. So this is just to say that there are perhaps lots of different reasons. You pick what you prioritize. That in terms of the interactions between Latin American companies and Asian companies, particularly Chinese companies, that is growing, and that growing interaction, plus everything else that you've been explaining during the course of this session, makes it clear why it makes sense for companies in China that have businesses with Latin America and Latin American companies that have businesses with China or Asia to consider HKIAC as one of the centers to administrate their disputes in case they arise.
Thank you very much, especially for your positive comments about what to do in Hong Kong. Fun. It's certainly, I'm not from Hong Kong, but I would say it's probably one of the most efficient places that I've ever lived, and I think that reflects in its laws as well, and in the way that the centre runs. And I think if you've not been here and you're perhaps from somewhere that's further away, you may not really know what to expect, but what you do get is an international city, and I think that's the same by analogy to the arbitration infrastructure that John talked about. There are no surprises there. The way things are done is how you'd expect an international arbitration process to be done, and that's the same in terms of HKIAC's governance and the people that are involved with it. So thank you for sharing a little bit, and thank you for waiting to get to that point. A few comments, just really from John and Claudia, and brief observations really, or experience that you think might be of interest to those on the call from Latin America about doing business or resolving disputes, that preferences and styles of mainland Chinese parties, for example, or those from Asia. I don't know if either of you want to kick off, but any general observations, just perhaps taking a little bit of a step back from what we've already discussed.
If you want, I can start. I think that what I'm going to say is obvious, but when you've interacted and worked with Chinese companies, that it becomes really critical and crucial. It's understanding the cultural differences and how fundamental it is to really have a successful representation of a client, or to really help the client to solve their disputes. And understanding that the way in which each one of the parties, that their mindset, the way they operate, the way they prioritize things becomes really key and fundamental. As you all know, in these big infrastructure projects, for example, or in disputes that are complex, a lot of teamwork is required between counsel and the client in the preparation of the case and in every stage of the arbitration. And so understanding those cultural differences is really fundamental for, first, effective communication. Second, for adequate planning. Third, also for being able to adequate and timely reporting, for timely decision making, because sometimes decision making operates in a different way. So you really need to understand these cultural differences so that you can actually have timely decision making that is necessary during the course of the arbitration. And in general, to define the appropriate, I would say, strategy of the case. And in that context, in my experience representing Chinese parties, especially in infrastructure projects, what I've seen is that they tend to strongly prioritize the completion of the project. Delivering the final product for them is really fundamental, even if that means settling certain disputes that otherwise they could have taken to arbitration with a high probability of winning them, or even if sometimes that means just not entering into certain discussions or not sending certain letters with a certain content. So that is something that you need to factor in when advising, I think, and that's again based on my experience, Chinese parties in the resolution of their disputes. And just to finalize there, another thing that we've noticed is that they do have a very strong preference for amicably settling the disputes, no? Negotiating an amicable settlement that brings the dispute to an end is perhaps their preferred mechanism to solve disputes. And in my experience, the decision-making process to file for arbitration may even take longer when Chinese or Asian parties are involved when compared to parties coming from LATAM or Europe or the USA, because they actually do want to try to settle amicably or negotiate or mediate before actually entering into the arbitration. So an increasing preference for this kind of resolution mechanisms like mediation or mechanism is something that I do see often.
Thank you very much. Thank you. John?
Sure. No, and I totally agree with what Claudia said around, I think, two of the themes that she touched on, which is the importance to Chinese parties of an amicable settlement. I think that's absolutely true. And also at the same time, though, recognizing that this can actually be quite tricky. We do have many international clients from Latin and elsewhere who do struggle with some of the cultural differences that Claudia touched on, because while there may seem to be a desire on the part of Chinese parties to settle, and there generally is, I think the challenges around these cultural differences, though, can still make the gap, as it were, in a potential settlement quite wide. And I think part of the reason for this is because Chinese parties generally have a less institutionalized decision-making process. So it is not really a situation where you might be in the room with, say, a very experienced contractor from a developed country who might come in the room and have a clear sense of they want to settle for $20 million, for example, or $30 million. They go in the room and they know what is the ballpark settlement figure they're looking at. Now, with Chinese parties, because, and again, this is a generalization, clearly there are Chinese parties with a great deal of experience in arbitrations and fighting it all the way, but you do find that sometimes there's a less clear-cut decision-making process internally. Now, this does mean that, unfortunately, there's risk of what I would call misfires, which is that a Chinese party may seemingly come across as being less predictable or even erratic in the behavior when it comes to decisions around or negotiations around a potential settlement. But that simply illustrates a different approach to how they make decisions, rather than some kind of inherent idiosyncratic behavior on the part of a Chinese party. So, 3 tips here in enhancing the prospects of a settlement with a Chinese party. First of all, in discussions that you have, find out who is the real decision maker on the other side in the Chinese party. The real decision maker is not necessarily the person opposite you, across from you on the table. It may not be the person that you're dealing with regularly, but who is the genuine decision maker behind the speaker who is making these decisions. And again, because you may find that some of these discussions are taking place in English, quite often the person communicating on the Chinese side in English is not necessarily the person who is sufficiently senior to be making the real decision. So find out who is the real decision maker. A second tip I would say is, after you find out who is the real decision maker, then try to get a sense of what they genuinely want. And again, it's important. The person on the other side of the table is communicating with you. What they say may not generally represent what the real decision maker behind the scenes is looking for. And here again, often we find international parties struggling with this a little bit because they find they have this sense that the goalposts keep shifting as they negotiate with a Chinese party, because seemingly the person you're communicating with will give you a sense of this is what they're looking for in terms of a resolution, and you come back in the next meeting and the goalposts have shifted. And the reason for that is often the person you're communicating with is not the genuine decision maker. So if whoever you speak with has to go back and they come back with new instructions, with a new sense of what they're looking for, and that can make it difficult. So a second tip is try to find out what is really generally in the ballpark of what the Chinese party on their side is looking for. Again, I underscore, these are all generalizations, but as far as they go as guidance, I think they're useful. And we then come to the third tip that I touched on, which is be very, very clear in your communications with the Chinese party on the other side. Try to be very direct
to avoid miscommunication. Because again, if there's miscommunication through the channels of engagement on the Chinese side, it just makes it that much more difficult to settle a dispute. These disputes, again, often do arise, I entirely agree with Claudia, due to cultural differences, misunderstandings, and frankly, built-in biases on both sides. And it is critical to nip these in the bud by making sure that you're being very clear in your communications and that this message is being received loud and clear to whoever is the ultimate decision maker. So again, if you look at your typical Belt and Road initiative, infrastructure investments projects, and we've seen this in quite a few cases, that often who is genuinely behind the scenes making the decision? One of the challenges is who is going to take responsibility for settlement? And this touches on Claudia's point, because again, that's one of the reasons why sometimes you find a reluctance to commence arbitration, because if you do, then someone on the other side needs to write a report and justify internally to management what has gone wrong, which justifies taking an arbitration, and there's often reluctance to do that. So who has to take responsibility in it? How are they conveying what has gone wrong internally? Are they blaming your side for having created the problem, which would then make a settlement much more difficult? Or do they acknowledge that there's some responsibility internally on the part of the Chinese party? And I'll leave one final point on this, which is in many Belt and Road projects, as we know, state funding is involved, and where state funds are being used, this adds an additional layer of complexity around a potential settlement. Because again, who's provided funding, who's prepared to take the hit in terms of a write-off on the project. Those are all broader considerations that often drive the feasibility of a settlement. And again, the ability to discern this in discussions with a Chinese party, I think are critical in terms of your likelihood of then reaching a successful settlement.
Thank you, John. Really helpful comments there, and obviously from decades of practical experience. So thank you very much both. We have come to the end of the presentation part, but we have allowed a little bit of time for questions. If you have them, pop them in the chat box or raise your hand, or even amongst us speakers, if we have questions for the other, please do share those. I've seen one from Joaquin. Where can we find HKIAC's model arbitration clause? And I think Louise has helpfully popped the clause into the chat. So thank you, Louise. It's there. And then the second part of the question is, has HKIAC handled any cases involving Latin American parties with the seat of arbitration in Latin America? The short, well, we haven't as yet. As I said, we have had cases involving Latin American parties, and we have appointed arbitrators from Latin America, but we haven't yet seen an arbitration seated in a Latin American jurisdiction for the moment. As we know, there's no reason why that can't happen with HKIAC rules and a seat in Latin America, but we haven't seen it yet. And I did mean to mention we do have our rules in translated in both into Spanish and Portuguese. So I suppose the only thing missing, in fact, is to have an arbitration seated in Latin America. So that's the one question I've seen there. Do we have any others? Please do raise your hand and feel free to unmute and ask your question. We have been through a lot of material, so you may well be digesting. Just taking a look. I can't see any at the moment, so perhaps as long as I'm not missing them, that's my main concern. Okay, well, I think Maria and Ines, I don't know if you have anything.
Yes, well, I can pose a question because our attendees are shy today. So, yes, maybe a question for any of you. What parties to a transaction between Latin American and Asian or Chinese, if you want more specifically, parties should take into account when they agree on arbitration, HKIAC arbitration? What what are your main recommendations, maybe a couple of them, when those parties are at the transaction time agreeing the dispute resolution clause under the HKIAC rules?
Perhaps I can kick off. I think as we mentioned earlier, I think if there is a mainland Chinese element and you are considering HKIAC rules, then I think the important thing there is to consider Hong Kong as a seat. So if you're thinking about drafting the arbitration agreement and you're considering HKIAC, then I think it is important in the context of any mainland Chinese projects and contracts that Hong Kong as a seat is considered. So that's probably just from a completing your arbitration agreement perspective, having your seat and your rules. There's mainland Chinese element, please consider that. And I think other things to think about more broadly about HKIAC, and John talked through these, but I think making or being aware that there isn't a scrutiny process. So, and that was an active choice by the centre when we first introduced our own administered rules in 2008. They were largely inspired by, let's say, the UNCITRAL arbitration rules. So they will be internationally familiar. And as I said of Hong Kong, it's the same of the HKIAC rules. There really aren't any surprises there. And so we don't scrutinise. And it's not to say one is good and one is not, but it's what we offer. And we do note that parties appreciate having that option. Naturally, that reduces the time and of course any associated costs with that. The important thing to note there though is we're very close as an institution to the way that arbitrators are appointed. So we don't have nominations committees necessarily. We have our appointments committee and we have the secretariat. And so we're very close to the recommendations that we make. We engage with the potential arbitrators that we're considering. And so the process for the appointment is done with a very close inspection from the Secretariat together with the Appointments Committee. So that's on arbitral appointments. And then the other point to make in relation to that is under the HKIAC rules, again, light touch. So in the context of a 3-member tribunal, the centre won't automatically make the appointment. The rules provide that the 2 co-arbitrators will have the right to appoint the presiding arbitrator in the first instance, and sometimes that will also give comfort to parties who are looking for more of a light touch approach. And also, as was mentioned, in terms of paying the arbitrator's fees, it's quite important to remember that you have a choice under the HKIAC rule. So it's not just ad valorem, which is based on the amount in dispute. You can, in fact, pay your arbitrators based on the hourly rate, which actually can be an important decision when the dispute arises, because if it's a very high loan agreement, but the basis of the dispute is very simple, then in fact the hourly rate approach is probably going to be more cost effective. Whereas if it's a complex construction dispute, perhaps a slightly lower value, but the time of the arbitrators will be a lot, then perhaps mounting dispute is a good option. So there are a few features that are distinct in that way. I don't know, John and possibly Claudia, but whether you wanted to supplement. I suppose you're sometimes more closely involved with the negotiating phase.
Sure. Why don't I add 2 comments? The first is in relation to thinking carefully about how you structure your suite of various agreements. Because as I mentioned, we're seeing a great many consolidation, join the type applications and applications to start a single arbitration under multiple contracts. And I think you would just see simply more and more of these. So in the context of a LATAM Belt and Road type agreements, for example, you may well have issues involving, say, a main contract, main construction contract, and a subcontract sitting underneath that. So think about whether the dispute arises, you want the ability to join up disputes under both the primary or main construction contract as well as a contract underneath. There are, of course, pros and cons in being able to do that, but think carefully about how you structure that. And of course, the HKIAC rules, if used properly, does allow you very effectively to bring in disputes under these various agreements and have them resolved in one proceeding. So that's the first point. Think about structuring and how you do in particular with multiple related overlapping contracts. Second point would be around the language of the arbitration. Again, particularly relevant to what we've been talking about. So mainland parties often are much more comfortable with Mandarin Chinese as the language of the arbitration. Quite a number of HKIAC arbitrations are conducted with dual language, both Mandarin Chinese and English. And of course, there's no reason why you can't, if you want, to add in Portuguese or Spanish as another additional language of the arbitration. I would just add the obvious point, and we've seen this, that as you add more and more languages, the arbitration becomes invariably a lot more costly and expensive. And the reality is, of course, the tribunal always only converse in one language. But I think what may well make your Chinese party more comfortable is you could, for example, agree that merely the oral proceedings will be, for example, interpreted into Mandarin Chinese or Spanish or whatever other language one wants. And that may well make it easier to agree a choice of, for example, Hong Kong arbitration with the Chinese party.
We've got a couple of questions in the chat. The next one here is HKIAC offers a distinctive service of tribunal secretaries. Yes, we do. How could that be of assistance to arbitrators sitting in HKIAC arbitrations? So yes, firstly, we do have a tribunal secretary program within the Secretariat. So effectively what that means is members of the case management team, counsel, deputy counsel, managing counsel, can be selected to sit as tribunal secretary in cases where they are not the case manager. And what you get with that is actually all of the experience, the rich experience that the team has in handling HKIAC arbitrations. And so tribunal secretaries will bring that to support the arbitral tribunal in the work that they do. And we, with tribunal secretaries in general, obviously there's a cost advantage because having certain tasks put to a tribunal secretary whose hourly rate is significantly less than that of the tribunal can, of course, lead to time and cost savings. And so we do see quite regularly members of our case management team be appointed as tribunal secretary. I don't know, please, John and Claudia, if you have anything to add, please feel free to do so. I know we're close to time, so I will also just take the third question in the chat, again from Joaquin, thank you. What's the average rate? It's getting late. What's the average hourly rate for arbitrators that the centre applies? Good question. So as John mentioned, at HKIAC, we have a cap on the hourly rate. Again, you can either pay based on the amount of dispute or hourly rate. Now, if it's hourly rate, there's a cap on the amount that an arbitrator can charge, which is currently around $840 US. And people always, eyebrows get raised. And the point here is that's the maximum. So what that does is even the most senior arbitrators, unless parties agree or HKIAC really thinks there's something exceptional, an exceptional reason, the highest they can charge is that. So it's put as the highest point. But most arbitrators will charge less than that. Of course, that depends on the size of the dispute, etc. But we would see a range of between, let's say, and now I won't do the conversion well, but about sometimes 3,500, 3,000 Hong Kong dollars, up through to 6,500. So you could have a range, but let's say somewhere in the middle, maybe about 5,000 or 4,500 is what we commonly see. But it's very Hong Kong dollars, but it's very specific, of course, to the particular dispute. But we do have a control there by having a maximum amount that the arbitrator can charge. Okay,
Perfect.
great. Thank you. I think we'll stop there in that case, if that's okay, Maria Ines, if you're happy.
Yes, of course, we are on time.
Wonderful.
Yeah, please.
In that
Yeah.
case, I will probably just finish by saying a huge thank you again to Ala and to Maria Ines, and of course to John and to Claudia, without whom much of HKIC's work wouldn't be done, and in particular to John and his real heavy involvement with the Proceedings Committee. So thank you enormously for both your contributions today and obviously to the participants. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I second those thanks, and really this has been an enriching panel, and it's really important for different jurisdictions to be connected, to know more about each other, and this is a must for us because there are and there will continue being transactions between Asia, China, and Latin America, and that's a very good news. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your time. Thank you for your contributions, and keep in touch. Thank you for to all of the attendees, and well, we will have a next meeting, virtual meeting or in-person meeting, because as I said at the beginning, this is a collaboration pathway. So keep tuned. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very
Bye
much.
bye. Have a good day. At night.
You too.
Thank you.
Ciao.
Ciao.